Tonight the topic will be getting the most out of your acreage for livestock, and our speaker will be Dr. Jaymelynn Farney. She is our Extension Beef System Specialist, and she is located out at the Southeast Research Station out by Parsons. So Dr. Farney, if you're ready, I will hop off of here.
Thank you for that introduction, Jeff. And I was kind of tasked, like I said, the title's a little bit maybe of a misnomer of what I'll be talking about, because Jeff and them had kind of asked me to give you a good starting base from a forage perspective for some of those other animal talks that you'll be seeing through the remainder of this series. So I have four kind of main points that I'll be discussing. The first one is your forage or grass options, and how that corresponds to maybe some specific grazing periods. And that most of what I'm going to be talking about can be applicable to any ruminant species. So that's your sheep, your goats, your cattle. If you're looking into llamas and alpacas, they classify in there. And I will throw in a little bit of horse stuff every once in a while, even though horses aren't ruminants. When you talk about some stalking rates and intakes and stuff like that, that's similar in regards to determining that with your horses as anything else. And I kind of mentioned about stalking rates. That's another big topic I will spend some time on. And then talking about some grazing management options, including how to use some more intensive management. That's what MIG stands for, management intensive grazing, to be able to get more utilization out of the property that you have. And then definitely talk about, especially as it's related to some of this co-species grazing, different livestock preferences for forages. Now, specifically when we're looking at cattle, when we're talking about grazing and forages, there is a huge laundry list of different things that we can look at. There's different types of grazing. You can have continuous grazing, intensive early stocking, deferred grazing, where you don't graze early in the season, but you graze it later, a rest rotation, high intensity, low. For the purpose of today, we're not going to get into all of those specific options. There's a lot of things you can do, and that makes it really good from the fact that you can adapt all these different managerial practices to fit your operation. You can implement intensive grazing if you only have 40 or 80 acres, as well as somebody who has 2 to 10 sections of ground. So we are able to adapt for what your environment and your goals are. And there's a lot of different forage bases, and you'll hear a lot of things about native range. One of our big ones we have that everybody loves to talk about is our tall grass native range. It's through the Flint Hills of the eastern side of Kansas. But we also have short grass native prairies. And then we also have tame grasses. And right there in you guys' neck of the woods, the 3 counties who are kind of sponsoring this, you do have quite a few tame grasses. And I like to use the word tame grass instead of improved pastures, because some of the grasses that we're talking about for that, if you ask certain people, they'll say, fescue, that's not an improved grass. Why are we talking about that? So tame grasses are essentially something that you purposefully plant in regards to looking at improving your forage production for your animals. Your yards, if you'd planted them specifically to Bermuda sod or something like that, that's a tame grass, something you purposefully planted. Residues, that is anything that you can get a hold of that's an aftermath off of a crop, a grain crop, like corn residues, sorghum, so after they've taken the milo off. You can even graze some soybean stubble after you've harvested the beans. Those are what I mean by residues. And then annual forages, they are plants that, as the name indicates, you must plant or drill or broadcast, something like that, every single year. They won't just continually grow. A perennial means that it continually grows every year. You don't have to apply a new seed bed to it. And so annual forages are something I kind of spend a lot of time researching. And in your neck of the woods, you have a pretty good soil for a bunch of these different annual forages, and they in general can produce quite a bit more tonnage than some of our native species. So that was quite, that was a long introduction to get to the nuts and bolts of the talk. So when we look at our forage production, crazy colored spaghetti, so don't panic. I'm going to kind of walk you through or talk you through some of the things on this figure. But, I'd mentioned kind of those 4 categories of grasses, your natives, your annuals, the residues, and then your tame grasses. Well, this figure just depicts across time when we expect to see the forage production occur. And this is a calendar year, January through December along the x-axis. And then the y-axis is just kind of it's not exact biomass amounts, but it just shows you that certain plant species have times of the year where they produce a lot of biomass and other times when they produce nothing. So for example, in some of our cool season perennials, which fescue and brome grass are in Kansas, our 2 most popular cool season perennials, they have what we call a biannual or bimodal type of growth, where you have where the first blue arrow is around April and May, a huge amount of biomass production during that time. And then you have a secondary growth of biomass or tonnage production in that October timeframe. However, if you keep following that blue line and look in July and August, it goes down to about 0 because that is when your cool season perennials go dormant. They're not growing anymore. So you don't have any more tons of grass being produced at that time. Now, another example to look at in regards to timing of growth is the green line, which is a cool season annual. So this is something that we would purposefully plant. And typically we plant these cool season annuals in September, October timeframe. Here in Kansas, our most popular cool season annuals, wheat, oats, and barley. A lot of people also like rye, but you're right there in the middle of wheat country, so rye is often not a good forage to plant just because folks were worried about cross-contamination with their wheat production. But we can see, I'd already mentioned that oftentimes our annuals will produce a little more biomass than our perennials. You can see that cool season annual in October through December has more biomass than our cool season perennial in the blue. And it kind of peaks a little earlier in March timeframe instead of May. So just because they're cool seasons doesn't mean they have the same growth pattern. And that's even further illustrated in this gray circle. These are all of your warm seasons. And as the name indicates, your warm season, it has more growth during the times when your temperatures are high, whereas it does not grow over the winter months. And, just another illustration, you can see there's quite a bit of difference depending on the perennials are in the red bar, so they kind of peak a little earlier. You have some legumes. When we say legumes, that's like alfalfa, clover, lespedeza. Those are some examples of some legumes. And kind of peak in the intermediate time frame, and then your warm season annuals, they kind of have biomass a little later on the season. So there's a lot of information here, a lot of different growth curves, but that's what makes it really good, because then you can match your growth curves to what your animal's requirements are. In that first figure, I just kind of categorized them by whether they're an annual or perennial, a cool season or a warm season. But just because they're a cool season annual does not necessarily mean that they have the same growth or the amount of tonnage that they'll produce. This is a figure off of a project that I had done in 2014 and 2015. And these are winter annuals that we planted. That's barley, oats, rye, or wheat. And you can even see up to 3 months after planting that the oats and barley produced nearly twice as much forage as the rye and the wheat. And this was when, this is a small snapshot, but when we planted the barley and when we planted all of these, we planted like in August, but we only measured until about December. Well, rye and wheat, even though they are cool season annuals, they produce more tonnage in that February time frame, not in that November, December like our oats and barley. Lots of information, lots of things, lots of moving parts. Go visit with your extension personnel if you're looking to put in some of these annuals, and they can help you match their growth with what you're expecting to see for your animals. This just further illustrates, here's some more numbers showing the difference in production that you can see with these different annuals. And sometimes it could be pretty drastic, like where radishes produce almost twice as much production as a turnip did. And on your legumes, the same thing. So I strongly recommend, if you are going to plant an annual, definitely go and visit with your extension professionals, and they can help guide you to what could be an economical option for biomass production. Now, I'd already kind of alluded to, we want to match a cow's requirement. Well, I say cow, that's what I work with most of the time, but any type of animal, mammalian species, we have requirements for energy, for protein, minerals, etc. And this just shows for cattle in the yellow line with the squares, that is a spring cow. And I'm not sure and I will apologize if there are some more experienced cattle producers on this video conference. But for those who this is very new information, when I say spring calving cow, that means that they have their babies during the spring. Cattle, they can have calves any time of the year. Essentially 284 days or 283 days after a bull breeds them, they can have a baby. Whereas sheep, on the other hand, and horses, they are more day-length breeders. So there's certain times of the year that they are bred, and in turn, certain times of the year that they lamb or foal. So you need to take those into account when you're looking at your forages. So I was just showing in this figure kind of an example of a spring calving cow. So that means she has a baby in March, in the springtime. You can see in April, this energy requirement is higher than it was in March. Well, that animal is lactating. And in cattle, and actually most species, it's within those first couple of months after they have their offspring that they have their highest milk. And milk is a very high energy and protein demanding process for our animals. And so that's why you can see in that April-May time frame, that's 2 to 3 months after that cow had calved, she has her highest energy demands. And then it slowly tapers off until about September, when we had caused the animal to be weaned, that baby calf to be weaned. So cessation of lactation occurred. If you look at the green, this is a fall calving cow. So that means she had her baby in the fall. So I have her having a baby in September. So that 2 to 3 months after calving, when she has her highest energy demands, is October and November. Steadily decreases till we wean that baby calf in April. And then it kind of comes back up as they're in their last trimester. The animal requires a little more energy to go into that fetus. So that shows you your energy demands for that cow. In this upper right-hand corner, I have what is the energy offered by some of these winter annuals. And you can see that the energy offered in the feed is higher than the energy demands of any of those cows. And so just like in humans, when your calories in are higher than your calories expended or calories out, what happens? You get chunky. So you put on a little extra weight. So that could be something that it's good if you have thin cows that you're looking to improve some weight and condition on. But if your cow's already in great condition, then you might not necessarily want to spend the extra money to put in this type of a forage. Another example is looking at how your management of whatever your pasture is can impact the quality of it. When I use quality, that just means the energy and protein values in particular is what I'm going to talk about today of that grass. So I have FESCUE. This is a picture of some FESCUE, and I'm looking at crude protein. So that's the protein requirement that cattle, horses, sheep, goats, we have specific crude protein requirements for the animals. And this was looking at the crude protein of the FESCUE, whether we added fertilizer, and I'm not going to go into that because I believe that that's going to be another topic later, but fertilization results in more biomass production. And so applying correct fertilization, fertility measures is very important. And once again, your local extension agents can help you determine soil test with your forage that you have and come up with the amount of fertilizer you need to put out there. But in addition to improving biomass production, you can improve the quality, especially on these tame grasses. So you can see a lot of lines, a lot of figures, but we either applied 50 pounds of actual nitrogen in February, which is the yellow line, 100 pounds of actual nitrogen in February, the gray line, or 50 pounds of actual nitrogen in August, the purple line, or 100 pounds of actual nitrogen in August, the forest green line. In April, when you measure for protein, when you'd applied your fertilizer in April or in February, you had much higher protein values. As the plants grow in June, we had very similar protein values. And then when you added more fertilizer in August, you can, and I will try and make the dill draw correctly. Here we go. Now you can see. Maybe that helps you see what I'm illustrating. So when you'd added your fertilizer in August, you have a much higher protein in October than if you didn't add a fertilizer. So that kind of goes into also that forage management decision of what do you do. And I said, I'm just whetting your appetite for more information to help you with your operational decisions. And sorry, I forgot that I had included this as well. These lines indicate the protein requirements dependent on the cow size and their stage of production. So a dry cow means that they aren't lactating, and a pregnant one in her third trimester has a higher protein requirement than one who's in her middle or her second trimester. If that cow is lactating, she has an even higher energy demand or higher protein demand. and a lighter weight animal has less of a protein demand. So lots of moving parts. I keep saying that. It's a lot of moving parts, but you need to know what your animal is, what stage of production they are in, and what your forage is and how you've managed the forage. All of that goes together to make your grazing management plan. So I just kind of threw this in more from the handouts. So I'm going to send these slides to Mr. Seiler, Marston, and Ryan as well, so that you could get a copy of these slides to process at a little later date as well. But, you know, the general rules of thumb, your spring cows, they have their highest energy and protein requirements during the summer. Your fall cows have their highest energy and protein demands during the winter. So if you decide to have a spring calving herd, you want to make sure that you have the best quality feed for them during that summer. That's as simple as I can make that. Whereas with your fall calving cows, late fall, early winter, that's when you want them to have their best quality diet, because that's what they need to meet their requirements so that they can stay being a functioning, growing, reproducing animal. Just re-illustrated for those of you who wanted exact values of how many pounds of energy and protein a cow needs a day. And then here's your two examples of whether you were, say, an April calver or a September calver. And I am sorry, my slide disappeared, but I also had put in there some just comments about goats, sheep, and horses, but it's very similar. When they're lactating, that's when they need their highest quality feed. Sheep also need another splurge of energy at the time that they are breeding, which that is called flushing. So when you provide a little extra energy at flushing, you get a higher twin rate or triplet weight rate and higher preg rates. For sheep, traditionally, you know, most breeds, and there's some breeds that can be bred both in the spring and the fall, but traditionally most sheep are bred in the fall to have lambs in the spring. So spring winter time frame. So you want to make sure you can meet energy demands based off of, or make your forage base meet your animals' individual energy demands. So now that we've came up with that, it's like, okay, now how many animals can I run on my property? So in order to do that, you need to know what your animals' intake requirements are, what they are going to consume, determine how much forage is available out there, and determine how many days you want them to graze on that forage. Now, just because we can sit there and do the math and the calculations does not necessarily mean that it's going to work every time. Cattle don't read the book and follow our directions all the time. Well, I could put horses and sheep and goats and alpacas, etc. They don't necessarily follow what we had calculated. So you need to have some contingency plans in all the time when you're developing your grazing plan. Now, there's a lot of terms that you'll hear thrown out about how to determine your stocking rate and carrying capacity and AUMs or animal unit months. If you're really into that range ecology component, have at it. For the purpose of today's talk, I'm just going to give you some general rules of thumb that'll help you determine how much and what you can do to stock for your animals. Now, traditionally, when you hear AUM, or animal unit months, that is the amount of forage a 1,000-pound animal, or a 1,000-pound unit, and So that's a unit. So the unit is 1,000 pounds of horse, 1,000 pounds of sheep, 1,000 pounds of cow, etc. That's how much they need to consume in 1 month. And so when you have 1,000, you get an animal equivalent of a 1, whereas a sheep gets a 0.2. And I'm going to try and circle that for you, where you can see where that number is. And that is primarily driven by the fact that a big sheep weighs about 200 pounds instead of 1,000 pounds. So you can use those equivalents to offset and calculate what your animal needs. Horses are the same thing. If you have a 900-pound horse, you have a 0.9 AUM requirement for that animal. So I want you to go ahead and start thinking about this for a second. If I'm saying 1 AUM is a 1,000-pound cow, but there's 0.2 AUMs for 1 sheep, essentially you can run 5 sheep on the same acres as you could that 1,000-pound cow. So if you're looking to try and get the most animals on your piece of property, you might need to look into the smaller animal. Horses, very similar to cattle, but are even a little bit rougher on your property. Now, some other little rules of thumb, once again, because I am a beef person, I threw in most of the beef numbers. Approximately 80% of a cow's weight is how many pounds of forage they will eat in a given month. So if you have a 1,284-pound cow eating 80% of her body weight, she needs to eat a little over half a ton of feed a month. Whereas that 1,000 cow, she only needs to eat 800 pounds of feed per month. So the smaller the animal, the less they eat, and in turn, the more you should be able to put on the acreage that you have. Now, some other things that we need to think about when we're trying to determine stocking rate and grazing is we want to follow the take half, leave half rule. So essentially what that means, and this, we do this to maintain your plant vigorousness. If you eat or you let your animals consume more than half of the plant mass out there, before long, you have no grass left. So that is, I'm not going to get into the big scientific reason behind it, but allowing the animal to eat half of the above ground plant matter leads to a better root development. The more roots you have, the more grass you have. And so it's a pretty good little symbiotic relationship. However, if you let them graze much more than that, they have shallower roots, and therefore they're less likely to stay in production in your operation. Now, another thing that we need to take into account when we're calculating our stocking rate is cattle only use about half of what is out there, or well, half of that half. So essentially 25% of what is growing can be consumed by the animal. Now, you might be thinking, well, how come cattle waste that much? Well, in the process of walking through the pasture, they'll trample some of it. They'll lay down on some of it. And if they urinate and defecate on that grass, that spot, they're not going to eat it. And so as such, that needs to be taken into account. Now, I told you about all those crazy definitions. The simplest denomination or the simplest equation that you can use to help determine how many animals you can run on your property is you need to calculate the total forage produced, divide it by the number of days you want to graze, and what is that daily intake for whatever that one animal is. And then that tells you how many head. So I just have an example here. Say you have a 40-acre pasture. This is a pretty productive type of grass, but I'd calculated that you get on average about 13,500 pounds per acre of production over the full year on this pasture. Now, when we do our take half rule, you take your 40 by your 1350 times half, there's 270,000 pounds of available forage out there. However, the cattle only use half. So then technically there's only 135,000 pounds of consumable forage for the entire year on that 40 acres. So if you're wanting to see what is the maximum number of animals you can have on that full year on that 40 acres, you take the consumable amount, 365 days, and then the intake. And so that intake value, that 38 pounds per day, I had calculated that assuming I had a 1,200-pound cow who was going to have a baby calf inside. So that calf is going to eat some through a period of time. And so averaged across the whole year, they're going to eat 38 pounds of forage. So that means on your 40 acres, you can only run 9.7 cows. Actually, probably just do 9 because you can't have a portion of a cow. But that's the method that you go about calculating how many animals you can run on that property. And so you can use this same equation system and just change this intake value depending on what class of animal you have. Oops, sorry, I clicked the wrong button. Once again, you can visit with your extension professionals and they can help you determine that stocking rate component. Now, when we look at our grazing plans, there is many different things you can look at. The most commonly done grazing plan is what we call continuous grazing. There's one pasture, the livestock are on it all the time. There is what we call simple rotational grazing. So in this example, I have, so we've got that same, we'll just stick with my 40-acre example. So on this continuous grazing, you have 40 acres and all the cattle stay on the 40 acres all the time. In your simple rotational grazing, we've taken that 40 acres and split it up into 4 10-acre pastures. And so you let those cattle graze on that 10-acre pasture for a period of time and then move them to another pasture, and you allow that first pasture that you've been on to rest, and that should help increase the amount of production and utilization of your forage. And then with your intensive rotational grazing system, so once again, we've got those 40-acre pastures, or that 40-acre total amount of pasture. We have it split into 8. So now we have 5-acre paddocks that we are rotating the cattle through. And the smaller and the more number of paddocks you have, the less number of days they stay on there. So that's where you kind of get a little more of that management intensive grazing. So what are some of the advantages and disadvantages to these different grazing scenarios? The continuous, they have the lowest maintenance requirements and the least amount of capital dollars. You don't have as much money put into fencing, water sources, etc. Disadvantages, you have lower forage quality and yields, and in turn, because you have less yield, you have lower stocking rates. You have uneven pasture use, and that gets to becoming, that uneven pasture use means that they overgraze a lot of the area, and when they overgraze, you have weeds and other undesirable plants come up in that overgrazing. Horses are one of the worst about doing that, especially in this continuous grazing situation. Horses constantly are going after that really short new growth, and they'll just beat up certain areas, and they just keep beating it up and keep beating it up. And before long, you've got broom sedge or mustard or some other bad weed that you don't want out there. So how do you maybe manage for some of that? Like I said, go into that rotational grazing. So on the simple one, like I said, you'll increase your forage production and utilization. You have a better, kind of healthier pasture because of that rest period. And you could actually increase your grazing season. Now, one of the things that Missouri in particular has published some information on some of their tame grasses like fescue. I told you when we first did our stocking rate calculations that the cattle only can consume about 25% of what that forage is out there. If you go to a 4-paddock rotational grazing system, you go up to 35% of that utilization. So now when you're doing your calculations, going from that 25 to that 35% on your 40 acres, you get to run an extra 3 cows. So, a little bit of extra work can help you be able to put more animals. Purpose of this talk is how to get the most use out of your small acreage. Putting in a little bit extra management like this could be one way to do that. Now, of course, your disadvantages, you do have some more cost in regards to fencing and water systems. And yeah, this one here, the forage production and pasture utilization is not as good as in this intensive, but like I said, you went from 25 to 35. That's quite a bit of improvement in utilization. Now, when you go into this management intensive grazing, and well, I'm going to back up a split second to our simple rotational grazing. I kind of like this 4-paddock one, and you try and set up the number of animals to eat what's in the paddock in about 7 days. Makes it really easy. If you like to really check your cattle and work them every Saturday morning because you have other job or commitments or etc., you just say, okay, I want to move my cows every Saturday morning. And your cows learn that, and before long, they'll just walk through each paddock. You just open the gate, and it works out great. The management intensive grazing, because you're putting the same number of animals on a smaller acreage, you have to move them a lot more regular. And some in that management intensive grazing, they'll go what's called mob grazing, and they'll put anywhere from 4 to 5 times the stocking rate of what you should, and they stay on there for 6 hours, and then you move them. That's a little much, especially for maybe well, actually for all of us who have a job that's not just 100% on the farm. You could increase, kind of develop or put your number of animals per acre to set up this management intensive grazing where you move your cows once a day or every 3 days or something like that. So it's a little more manageable. But the more pastures you could put and the more days of rest and less number of days on the pasture is when you will result in having the highest forage production and use per acre. In some of these management intensive grazing, you can have the cattle actually consume and utilize almost 50% of the forage out there. So, you know, now we went from the 25% utilization up to 50%. You've doubled the amount of animals you can put on your property. As such, well, I said that your stocking rates can be increased because you're using more of the forage. You don't have near as much weeds and brush, mainly because you're forcing the animals to eat that weeds and brush. Now, the disadvantages, it really requires a lot of planning and really monitoring your forage supply. You may have calculated that there was enough forage for these animals to be out there for 3 days. Well, if you go out and after the second day, there's just nothing, you've ate it to the dirt, move the cattle. Even though it didn't fit in with how you'd budgeted, move the cattle. A lot more fence, a lot more water, and a lot more of your labor and time included. So that's where you have to work on your own operation and determine what you would like to do, what works into your home life, your farm life, your other activities, how much of this additional management you want to incorporate into your system. And of course, where your bottom line is, how much money do you want to put into infrastructure? Yeah, so this just shows you another bit. And there are people in the country that have 64 grazing units that they rotate their animals through very rapidly. Now, another component when you're talking about this utilization of your property as well as determining your grazing plans is this multi-species or co-species grazing. And, you know, my picture here has cows and sheep running together in the same pasture. So why would you think about looking into some of this co-species grazing? Well, in one of the big advantages and what really brought it up initially was for pasture and range management. Putting goats in to control your brush because cattle don't eat brush. That's one thing. Another one is some economic benefit potential. I'll talk about that a little bit in more detail. It diversifies your operation. Now you're reducing the risk of raising a single product. So by, you know, let's take some of the things that have happened in the beef industry lately. We had a fire at a huge packing plant last winter. It was killing a bunch of our cattle markets. I mean, just people were losing money hand over fist. But the guys who had lamb at the same time were making the highest profit they'd ever made. So if you had lambs and cattle at the same time, hopefully you could balance it out and have a net profit for your operation. And also, if you are looking into being a goat producer in particular, parasites become a huge issue. There's a lot of parasite, intestinal worms, etc. issues with your goats. When you have cattle in with the goats, the cattle will eat the worm larvae that came out of the goats and kill it. And so you've broken the life cycle of that larvae that is a detriment to the goat, and vice versa. Most of the cattle parasites. When the goat ingests them, it kills them and breaks their life cycles. So it's a way to break some of those intestinal worm or parasite resistant issues that we have, especially with the goats. So I mentioned about the using like sheep. This is just some rangeland, native pasture. On the left side, no sheep. On the right side, they had sheep grazing in with their cattle. Which do you think which would you rather have when people drive by your place? You sure would rather it be much prettier and cleaner like that. So using those two species together is one way to help keep your pasture looking higher quality. And that economic benefit potential. This is where I told you I was going to come into it a little more in detail. So traditionally with cattle, we get income about twice a year in a commercial operation. When you wean the calf and when you sell your culls, the ones that didn't breed or had foot problems or something. So you get 2 checks annually. With sheep, you could potentially get 3 checks that come at different times than when you get your cattle checks. You can get a check off of selling the wool, your lamb crop, and selling your culls. And then if you added goats in there as well, you get an additional 2 other marketing times when you sell the kids and your cull does. So, you know, potentially you could get 7 checks spread out through the year, cash flow return on your investment. That's one of the economic benefits of this co-species grazing. And so are the cattle, are our livestock very selective grazers? You should be saying, yep, she's already told us that. But how specific are they? So this just kind of shows you in general animal preference for plant species. Cattle like coarser grasses. So the kind of a bigger leafy grass, they like them. And they really prefer to eat it when it's 4 to 10 inches in height. Horses, on the other hand, and I've already told you this, they'll eat kind of any grass, but they really like it when it's only 2 to 4 inches in height. So your horses, like I said, they will just, if you don't move them after it gets 2 inches tall, they will just keep eating on it and keep eating on it and keep eating on it. Before long, your plant has no carbohydrate reserves and it's gone. And you just have weeds. And then the horses don't eat weeds very good at all. Sheep, they like finer stemmed grasses. So the ones that aren't quite as big in diameter. And they also really like weeds. And goats, you know, we force goats to eat a lot of grasses, but if you actually give them their preference, they love to eat seed heads. They like to eat bushes and browse, which that's kind of another fancy name for broadleaf plants. And this is just another way to show you when you have your grasses, broadleaves and legumes, or browse, aka kind of, well, and I am so sorry, I have to re-say this. Browse is a fancy word for saying brush, essentially. When you look at percentage of grass in the cow's diet, they eat 65 to 75% of their diet is grass. Whereas goats, much higher percentage of browse is their diet. And sheep are kind of intermediate. They, about half their diet's grass and half of it is leaves. Horses, very high on the grass. Little to no eating of any bushes. And Now, when you're looking at doing your multi-species grazing, here is a really good reference to help you with multi-species grazing, including a way to help you determine your stocking rates, because you'll have to take into account both cattle consumption, sheep and goat consumption, how much weeds you have, etc. When do you not want to do co-species grazing? If you're doing mob grazing, and I'm so sorry this popped up a little bit higher, but mob grazing, or that really, really management intensive grazing, when you're already forcing your cattle to consume everything, then your sheep and your cattle are competing for the same grass. And so you could potentially reduce gains in both of them. Same thing if you have a monoculture. Monoculture just means you only have one plant species out there. If you just have one plant species out there, more times than not, having just one animal type is the best way to use that property. You could have some marketing issues. I did, say right now sheep are a very good economic animal. They are making you a lot of money. But if you don't have anywhere to sell your sheep, or you don't know who to get a hold of to buy your lamb crop, that does you no good to have a bunch of sheep. Or if you can't find a place to take your wool, if you choose to have wool sheep. So you need to kind of come up with that. And predator issues, that is a huge problem, especially when you go with those small ruminants of your sheep and goats. And I didn't put in here, but also fencing. Goats need a very, very good fence. Plain 5-wire bob wire does not work very well to keep a goat in. They really need more woven wire. So that's another infrastructure thing you need to think about. So that was a lot of things I threw at you very rapidly. Like I said, here's my contact information, and you can get a hold of your agents. They know how to get a hold of me as well, and I will answer any questions you might have.